Salam, peace be upon you. Episode 13, Part 6, Gauge-relational essence. No absolute truth. Take one calm breath with me. We did not begin from space or time. We did not begin from matter or energy. We began from what makes anything readable at all. Phi was introduced as the primitive. Energy was reframed as tally, not substance. Reality requires licensing and coherence. Claims must carry prediction and falsification. And episode 12 installed the epistemic firewall as the discipline that stops narrative drift. Now episode 13 unfolds in two movements. First, undifferentiated phi, the permission layer. Phi before any readable change. Phi before any public structure. Phi as the silent ground that makes distinction possible at all. Second, differentiated phi. Phi once change becomes public and licensed. Once the readouts can be reconstructed, checked, shared, and audited. The first must come before the second for a simple reason. If we do not earn the permission layer, we will mistake the first shadows for the source of light. We will treat later readouts as primitives. We will build the old world again, just with new names. So we stay slow. We stay disciplined. We stay firewalled. Anchor A of this episode is the permission layer. What phi is, what phi is not, and why nothing can be built without earning comparability first. Anchor B is the public layer. How change becomes readable under licensing, how omega, kappa, and nu appear as inseparable readouts, how topology and tallies become lawful, how persistence and memory become possible, and how the firewall governs every claim. And right now, we are focusing on part 6 inside that larger arc. Very briefly, where we left off. In the previous part, we separated the confusion that poisons almost every worldview. We said, phi is not the outcome of difference. Phi is the capacity for difference. Not the painting, but the permission that painting can happen at all. Now we take the next necessary step. Because a private capacity is not enough. A universe that is only privately readable is not a public universe. It cannot be tested. It cannot be shared. It cannot be audited. It cannot become science. So we ask the question that sits like a gate in the road. If phi makes difference possible, what makes difference shareable? And the answer is what we call gauge-relational essence. Here is our contract with the firewall, spoken plainly. If you hear me smuggling space, time, energy, matter, or dynamics as primitives here, treat it as an error. Good. Now listen. I want to tell you one story, and I want to return to it again and again because it contains the whole idea in one clean crystal. Imagine a night when the world changes, but no one can notice. Tonight, while you sleep, everything grows 6 inches taller. Not just people, everything. Every door, every ceiling, every mountain path, every measuring tape, every ruler, every factory gauge, every lab instrument, every standard you could use to detect the change. Even the very patterns we use as standards. The marks on rulers, the distance between atoms in the metal of a caliper, the reference length inside a measuring device. They all grow too. Morning comes. You wake up, you stand, you stretch, you reach for a cup, you walk through the doorway. You look at your reflection, and nothing looks different. You measure your height. The ruler says the same number it said yesterday. The reason is not magic. The reason is simple. Nothing changed relative to anything else. And what cannot change in relation cannot show up in measurement. That is the central insight of gauge-relational essence. Now I will state the core claim. Absolute values of phi are meaningless. Only relations between values matter. Say it again, even simpler. Reality does not speak in absolute settings. Reality speaks in differences. If you shift everything together, you have changed nothing that can be publicly known. That is why the 6-inch night is so revealing. It shows you the boundary between what is physically meaningful and what is merely a choice of description. And that boundary is not opinion, it is an operational boundary. It is the boundary between what survives comparison and what vanishes when you change the reference. Now we name the thing that usually stays invisible. A gauge is a chosen reference. It is where you put zero. It is what you call baseline. It is the knob you set before you begin counting. You can choose different baselines and still describe the same reality as long as you translate consistently. And the reality that does not depend on your chosen baseline is a reality that can be shared. So gauge-relational essence means this. Phi does not come with a universal, built-in, absolute dial that says, this is the correct phase of the universe. There is no cosmic label printed on existence. There is only relational structure, patterns of difference that remain when labels change. Why does this matter? Because if you do not understand this, you will chase ghosts. You will invent problems that are not problems. You will mistake bookkeeping for ontology. You will ask questions whose grammar secretly assumes an absolute reference. And then you will suffer when the universe refuses to answer. You have seen this in ordinary life, even if you have never named it. Take the simplest thing, a number on its own, any number. Without relation, it is mute. It does not tell you what it means. It only tells you that you have chosen a scale. Now bring it back to phi. If phi is the primitive order that makes reality readable, then the first demand of a readable universe is that readings can be compared across observers. But comparison itself cannot depend on private baselines. So a public universe must be gauge-relational. Public meaning must be invariant under reference shifts. And that word, invariant, is the heartbeat of objectivity. Objectivity does not mean absolute. Objectivity means survives translation. If two independent observers with different instruments, different conventions, different labels can still agree on what happened, then what they agree on is not an absolute number. It is an invariant relation. So when people hear the phrase, no absolute truth, they sometimes panic. They think it means nothing is true. It does not. It means something sharper, stronger, and more disciplined. Truth is what survives when we change the reference. Truth is what remains when we shift the baseline. Truth is what does not care where you put zero. That kind of truth is harder than any dogma, because it can be tested, it can be audited, it can be carried across languages. Now let's make this holophase native. When phi becomes readable as change, we will later read omega, kappa, and nu as the first inseparable public phases of variation. But even before we talk about those readouts in detail, we can already state the condition they must satisfy. If I add a constant to phi everywhere, the public content must not change. Because adding a constant is exactly like the 6-inch night. It is a global shift. It moves the baseline. It changes the label. But it does not change any difference. And differences are the only things that can be shared. This is why, in any properly designed measurement of phi, what you access is never phi itself. What you access is phi relative to a reference. And you can change the reference without changing the reality you are describing. This is not a limitation. This is the signature of a real public quantity. Now, why do people resist this? Because our minds love absolutes. Absolutes feel safe. They feel like a foundation. They feel like a final answer. But an absolute that cannot be detected is not a foundation. It is a decoration. It is a story we tell ourselves because we want the universe to have a fixed label. The firewall is here to stop that craving from becoming a theory. Now let's make the point with strict operational clarity. A measurement is a procedure that outputs a value. But that output only becomes meaningful when you can compare it to something else. Another output, another state, another record. Even the act of reading 0 on a device is not absolute. It is a comparison between the device's current state and its chosen reference state. So the concept of an absolute measurement, in the sense of a measurement with no reference, is not just difficult, it is incoherent. It is like trying to point without a direction, or trying to count without a unit, or trying to speak without distinction. Now we can state the prediction. Prediction first. If gauge-relational essence is true, then no experiment will ever detect absolute phi. Not now, not later, not with future technology, not in any possible licensed window. Every successful operational access to phi will have this character. Change the baseline and the public content stays the same. Or say it in a way that can be checked under holophase discipline. If you reconstruct phi within a licensed window, and then you add a constant offset to the reconstructed phi everywhere in that window, every certified observable derived from phi must remain unchanged. Because certified observables are gauge invariant carriers of public truth. If any observable changes when you add a constant to phi, that observable is not public reality. It is instrument private bookkeeping. It is a leak. It is a failure of design or a failure of licensing. So here is an operational check any lab could in principle perform inside the holophase program. Take your reconstructed phase field within a licensed window. Compute your certified encoders. Now add an arbitrary constant to the phase field. Compute the encoders again. If the encoders change, you have not measured the public structure. You have measured your own reference choice. That is the prediction. Now the falsification. We do not hide. We do not say it must be so. We say what would kill it. If someone builds a device that measures absolute phi, a device that outputs the universe's phase without needing any reference, and if independent observers can verify that same absolute value across different devices, different labs, different conventions, then this claim fails. Say it in the clearest possible form. If absolute phi can be measured, gauge-relational essence is false. And let's state the requirements of such a falsification, so we do not accept weak substitutes. It must not rely on comparing to a reference beam, a reference clock, a reference pattern, a reference state, or a stored calibration. It must not hide the reference inside the machine. It must not smuggle in a ground disguised as hardware. It must output a value that has the same meaning for everyone without translation. And it must predict consequences that cannot be reproduced by relation-only descriptions. If someone does that, we revise the foundation. But notice something important. The firewall is not afraid of revision. The firewall demands it. Because science is not loyalty. Science is survival. Now, why do we say such a device is impossible in principle? Not because we are arrogant, not because we want to win, but because measurement is, by its nature, relational. The act of registering a value is the act of distinguishing that state from another. And distinguishing is comparison. So absolute phi is like a number with no relational hooks. It cannot act. It cannot be checked, it cannot be shared, it is silent. Let me slow this down and make it feel almost too obvious, because this is where people usually slip. Whenever you build a measuring device, you secretly build a reference into it. A bathroom scale does not know your absolute weight. It knows how much the spring compresses compared to how it was when the platform was empty. A thermometer does not know absolute heat. It knows how much its internal state changes compared to a chosen calibration point. A clock does not know absolute time. It marks regular cycles and compares one cycle count to another. Every instrument contains a before state, a baseline, a calibration, a reference condition. Sometimes that reference is explicit, like a zero button. Sometimes it is hidden, like a factory calibration. But it is always there. Because without it, the device would have no way to say what a reading means. So when someone imagines a device that measures absolute phi, they're imagining a device with no reference state at all. And that is not a device. That is a wish. Now, in holophase language, this shows up cleanly. The moment we talk about public access to phi, we are talking about differences, because differences are what survive translation. And this is not a special rule we impose. It is what the structure of a readable world forces. Think about what happens the moment you ask, how is phi changing? Change is a comparison between a state and another state. And when we later read omega, kappa, and nu, we are reading patterns of change. Patterns of change cannot care about a constant offset, because a constant offset has no edges, no contrast, no way to show itself. So gauge-relational essence is not an extra assumption we bolt on. It is the hygiene of any public universe. Now I want to put one more knife edge into the claim because it makes it more rigorous. It is not just that absolute phi cannot be measured. It is that absolute phi has no operational meaning. Cannot be measured could mean it is real but hidden. No operational meaning means it makes no difference to any public record, so it cannot enter firewall certified science. Now sharpen the prediction one more time. If you ever see a claim in holophase that depends on an absolute phase value, a claim that cannot be erased by shifting the baseline, then that claim is suspect. It is either unlicensed, instrument private, or a smuggling of primitives. Because the only certified content must be expressible in relational form. Two independent reconstructions using different hardware and different baselines must agree on the same relations within their certified uncertainty. Not the same absolute number, the same pattern of differences. This dissolves a common confusion. People often ask, where is the true zero? They ask it about money, about temperature, about calendars, about coordinates, and about the universe. But true zero is usually a convention, not a fact. Change the convention, and the world does not change. Only the labels do. So the same question is not, what is the true zero? The same question is, what relations are invariant across reasonable choices of zero? That is how the firewall teaches you to ask questions the universe can answer. Now let's touch one more consequence that will matter later, but we can state it safely now. If only differences matter, then identity cannot mean the same absolute value. Identity will mean the same relational signature under allowed transformations. So the moment you understand gauge relational essence, you are already holding the first key to how persistence and memory will later become certifiable. Not as absolute blobs, but as repeated relational patterns. Now bring it back one last time to the 6-inch night. If every measuring stick grew 2, you could not notice. Agreement is possible without a cosmic ruler because agreement comes from invariance, not absolutes. And this is why, when people talk about measuring phase in any serious experiment, what they really do is compare. They compare two paths. They compare a signal to a reference. They compare a present cycle to a previous cycle. That is not a weakness of our instruments. It is a fact about public knowledge. Even in ordinary engineering, you can feel this. Voltage is not a thing you own in isolation. It is a difference between 2 points, defined relative to a chosen ground. Change the ground, and the numbers change. But the physical relations that drive circuits remain. Gravitational potential is the same. It is not an absolute height of the universe. It is a difference that predicts how things fall relative to each other. The lesson is always identical. If your prediction changes when you shift every baseline together, then your prediction was never about the world. It was about your bookkeeping. So in holophase terms, gauge-relational essence is a design requirement. Any lawful encoder of phi must be built so that adding a constant to phi changes nothing it reports. Any claimed law must be phrased so that the baseline shift does not break it. Any claim that cannot survive that test is not a law. It is a coordinate choice wearing a crown. And this is exactly the kind of mistake episode 12's firewall was built to prevent. So when you feel tempted to ask, what is phi underneath it all, pause. That question is often just the mind asking for a private anchor. The public question is different. What differences can we certify, and which of those differences survive every change of reference? Now we must be careful about scope. This claim applies to public, measurable structure. It applies to the layer of reality where claims can be shared and tested. It does not apply to metaphysical cravings for a hidden absolute label. It does not apply to private feelings about ultimate values. It applies to the only domain where our firewall grants the word real a public meaning. The domain of licensed, auditable, comparison-based access. And we must be careful about timing in the episode. We are still in the first movement. We are still in undifferentiated phi in the sense that we have not yet unfolded the full public reconstruction story. We are not yet using omega, kappa, and nu as explicit readouts in our narrative. We are not yet building dynamics. We are not yet talking about objects, forces, histories. So what are we doing here? We are installing the constraint that must be true the moment public readability begins. We are saying, when phi becomes publicly readable, its public content must be relational. Otherwise, there is no public world. Now I want to show you what breaks if you ignore this. First, you start to worship absolute numbers. You start to think a measurement is a thing rather than a comparison. Then you start to imagine the universe contains a hidden true value behind every measurement, as if reality were an answer key. And then you build theories that chase the answer key instead of describing invariants. You confuse your coordinate choices with the world. You confuse your conventions with nature. And once you do that, you begin to argue about baselines as if they were facts. This is where people get trapped in false wars. One group chooses one zero, another chooses another. They argue about whose absolute is correct. But the truth is, neither absolute is the world. The world is what stays the same when you translate between them. Gauge-relational essence is the method that dissolves those false wars. Now you might object. You might say, if only relations are meaningful, what are the relations between? Don't we need things first? This is exactly where intuition tries to smuggle in objects as primitives. But remember our stance. Phi is the only primitive, so things cannot come first. What comes first is relational structure, and what we call things will later be certified as stable patterns inside that structure. In simple terms, a thing is a knot in a web, not a pebble that exists before the web. But we will earn that carefully in later parts, under licensing and persistence tests. For now, we only need the minimum point. Public meaning does not live in absolute labels. Public meaning lives in relations that survive changing labels. Now let's touch the energy point, carefully, without cheating. In holophase, energy is not a substance. Energy is a tally, a calibrated count derived from the temporal readout when we later reach differentiated phi. Because it is a tally, it inherits gauge-relational character. A tally can change when you change your bookkeeping. What matters are differences in tallies between states, because those differences are relational and operational. So when someone asks for the total energy of the universe as an absolute, the firewall raises an eyebrow. Is that total a public invariant? Or is it a baseline dependent sum? In a gauge-relational world, the safe answer is only what survives baseline shifts deserves the status of public quantity. So do not build metaphysics out of totals. Build predictions out of invariants. Now let's come back to our one story, because it is our anchor. The night the world grew 6 inches. That story is not about height, it is about meaning. If everything shifts together, the shift is unobservable. So if someone tells you they have discovered an absolute, ask them a simple question. If the entire universe shifted by the same amount, would your discovery still be detectable? If the answer is no, then your discovery is not a public property of reality. It is a property of your reference choice. And reference choices are allowed. They are useful. They are part of doing science. But they are not what science is about. Science is about what does not depend on them. Now let's say the core claim one more time so it lands. Absolute phi is meaningless. Only phi relations matter. Or even simpler, only differences speak. Absolutes are silent. Now let me give you the listener carry. One sentence you can keep when the details fade. Public reality is whatever survives when you change the baseline. Hold that. Because when we move into the next parts, we will need it. Soon we will speak about public carriers, how phi's differences become shareable without cheating. Soon we will speak about licensing, how we certify that what we reconstructed is not an artifact of our instrument. Soon we will speak about the first inseparable readouts, omega, kappa, and nuga. And we will treat them as readouts, not primitives. And in all of that, gauge-relational essence will be our constant discipline. It will remind us to ask again and again, is this statement invariant? Is it reference-free in its public content? Can two independent observers agree after translation? Does it survive the 6-inch night? If yes, it belongs. If no, it is private bookkeeping, and we do not worship it. Now we can close with calm continuity. In the next part, we will ask, if only relations speak, how does the universe carry those relations publicly? How does phi's difference become shareable without giving one observer the power to set the true baseline? That door opens next. For now, stay with the silent rule that makes public knowledge possible. Only differences speak. Absolutes are silent. Complete essence of this part in one breath. Gauge-relational essence means phi has no absolute dial. Every public fact is a difference that survives changing the reference. So our predictions and measurements must be invariant under baseline shifts, and any verified absolute phi device would falsify the claim. Always peace be upon you.